When he heard a voice thus calling to him, he was standing at the door of his box, with a flag in his hand furled around its short pole. One would have thought, considering the nature of the ground, that he could not have doubted from what quarter the voice came. But, instead of looking up to where I stood on top of the steep cutting nearly over his head, he turned himself about and looked down the line. There was something remarkable in his manner of doing so, though I could not have said for my life what. But I know it was remarkable enough to attract my notice, even though his figure was foreshortened and shadowed down in the deep trench, and mine was high above him, so steeped in the glow of an angry sunset that I had shaded my eyes with my hand before I saw him at all. "Hello! Hello! Below!" Hello! From looking down the line, he turned himself about again, and, raising his eyes, saw my figure high above him. "Is there any path by which I may come down and speak to you?" He looked up at me without replying, and I looked down at him without pressing him too soon again with repetition of my idle question. Just then there came a vague vibration in the earth, in the air, quickly changing into a violent pulsation, an oncoming rush that caused me to start back as though it had forced to draw me down. When such vapour as rose to my height from this rapid train had passed me and was skimming away over the landscape, I looked down again and saw him refurling the flag he had shown while the train went by. I repeated my inquiry, after a pause during which he seemed to regard me with fixed attention. He motioned with his rolled-up flag towards a point on my level, some 200 or 300 yards distant. I called down to him, "All right," and made for that point. There, by the dint of looking closely about me, I found a rough, zigzag descending path notched out, which I followed. The cutting was extremely deep and unusually precipitant. It was made through a clammy stone that became oozier and wetter as I went down. For these reasons, I found the way long enough to give me time to recall the singular air of reluctance or compulsion with which he had pointed out the path. When I came down low enough upon the zigzag descent to see him again, I saw he was standing between the rails on by which the train had lately passed, in an attitude as if he was waiting for me to appear. He had his left hand at his chin, and that left elbow rested on the right hand crossed over his breast. His attitude was one of such expectation and watchfulness that I stopped for a moment, wondering it. I resumed my downward way, and stepping out upon the level of the railroad, drawing nearer to him, saw that he was a dark, sallow man, with a dark beard and rather heavy eyebrows. His post was in as solitary and dismal place as I ever saw. On either side, a dripping wet wall of jagged stone, excluding all view but a strip of the sky. The perspective one way, only a crooked prolongation of this great dungeon, the shorter perspective in the other direction, terminating in a gloomy red light, in the gloomier entrance to a black tunnel, whose massive architecture was barbarous, depressing. There was a forbidding air. So little sunlight ever found its way to this spot that it had an earthly, deadly smell, and so much cold wind rushed through it that it struck chill to me, as if I had left the natural world. Before he stirred, I was near enough to have touched him. Not even removing his eyes from mine, he stepped back and lifted his hand. "This was a lonesome post to occupy," I said, "and it had riveted my attention when I looked down from up yonder. A visitor was a rarity, I should suppose. Not an unwelcome rarity, I hoped." In me he merely saw a man who had been shut up within narrow limits all his life, and who, being at last set free, had a newly awakened interest in these great works. To such purpose I spoke to him, but I am far from sure of the terms I used, for, besides, I am not happy in opening any conversation. There was something in the man that daunted me. He directed a most curious look towards the red light near the tunnel's mouth, and looked all about it, as if there was something missing from it, and then he looked at me. "That light was part of his charge, was it not?" He answered in a low voice, "Don't you know that it is?" The monstrous thought came into my mind that I perused the fixed eyes and the saturnine face, that this was a spirit, not a man. I have speculated since, whether there may have been infection in his mind. In my turn I stepped back, and in making the action, I detected in his eyes some latent fear of me. This put the monstrous thought to flight. "You look at me," I said, forcing a smile, "as if you had a dread of me." "I was doubtful, sir," he returned, "whether I'd seen you before." Where? He pointed to the red light he had looked at. There? I said. Intently watchful of me, he replied, but without sound. Yes. My good fellow, what should I do there? However, be that as it may, I was never there. You may swear. I think I may, he rejoined. Yes, I'm sure that I may. His manner cleared, like my own. He replied to my remarks with readiness and in well-chosen words. Had he much to do there? Yes. That was to say he had enough responsibility to bear, but exactness and watchfulness were what was required of him, and of actual work, manual labour, he had next to none. To change that signal, to trim those lights, to turn this iron handle now and again, was all that he had to do under that head. Regarding those many long and lonely hours, of which I seemed to make so much, he could only say that the routine of his life had shaped itself into that form, and he had grown used to it. He had taught himself a language down here, if only to know it by sight, and to have formed his own crude ideas of its pronunciation could be called learning it. He had also worked at fractions and decimaled, tried a little algebra, but he was, and had been as a boy, a poor hand at figures. Was it necessary for him, when on duty, always to remain in this channel of damp air, and could he never rise into the sunshine from between those high stone walls? Why, that depended upon times and circumstances. Under some conditions there would be less on the line than under others, and at the same held good as to certain hours of the day and night. In bright weather he did choose occasions for getting a little above these lower shadows, but, being at all times liable to be called by his electric bell, and at such times listening to it with redoubled anxiety, the relief was less than I would suppose. He took me into his box, where there was a fire and a desk for an official book, which he made certain entries. A telegraphic instrument with its dial face and needles, a little bell of which he had spoken. On my trusting that he would excuse the remark, he had been well educated, and, I hope to say without offence, perhaps educated above that station. He observed that instances of slight incongruity in such wise would rarely be found in such wanting among large bodies of men, that he had heard was so in workhouses, in the police force, and even in that last desperate resource, the army. And he knew it was so, more or less, in any great railway staff. He had been, when young, if I could believe it, sitting in that hut, he scarcely could, a student of natural philosophy, and had attended lectures. But he had run wild, misused his opportunities, gone down, and never risen again. He had no complaint to offer about that. He had made his bed, and he lay upon it. It was far too late to make another. All that I have here condensed, he said, in a quiet manner, with his grave dark regards divided between me and the fire. He threw in the word sir from time to time, especially when he referred to his youth, as though to request me to understand that he claimed to be nothing but what I found him. He was several times interrupted by the little bell, and had to read off messages and send replies. Once he had to stand without the door and display a flag as a train passed and make some verbal communication to the driver. In the discharge of his duties I observed him to be remarkably exact and vigilant, breaking off his discourse at a syllable and remaining silent until what he had to do was done. In a word, I would have set this man down as one of the safest men to be employed in that capacity, but for the circumstance that, when he was speaking to me, he twice broke off with a falling colour, turned his face towards the little bell when it did not ring, opened the door of the hut, which was kept shut to exclude the unhealthly damp, and looked out towards the red light near the mouth of the tunnel. On both those occasions he came back to the fire with the inexplicable air upon him which I had remarked, without being able to define when we were so far asunder. Said I, when I rose to leave him, "You almost make me feel as if I had met with a contented man." I'm afraid I must acknowledge that I said it to lead him on. "I believe I used to be so," he rejoined, in the low voice in which he had first spoken. "But I am troubled, sir. I am troubled." He would have recalled the words if he could. He had said them, however, and I took them up quickly. "With what? What is your trouble?" "It is very difficult to impart, sir. It is very difficult to speak of. If ever you make me another visit, I will try to tell you." "Well, I expressly tend to make you another visit. Say, when shall it be?" "I go off early in the morning, and I shall be on again at 10 tomorrow night, sir. And I will come at 11. He thanked me and went out to the door with me. "I'll show my white light, sir," he said in his peculiar low voice, "till you have found your way up. When you've found it, don't call out. And when you're at the top, don't call out." His manner seemed to make the place strike colder to me, but I said no more than, "Very well." "And when you come down tomorrow night, sir, don't call out. Let me ask you a parting question. What made you cry, 'Hello,' below there tonight?" "Heaven knows," I said. "I cried something to that effect." "No, not to that effect, sir. Those were the very words. I know them well." "I admit those were the very words. I said them, no doubt, because I saw you below." "For no other reason?" "What other reason could I possibly have?" "You had no feeling they were conveyed to you in any supernatural way?" "No." He wished me good night and held up his light. I walked by the side of the line of the rails, with a disagreeable sensation of a train coming behind me, until I found the path. It was easier to mount than descend, and I got back to my inn without any adventure. Punctual to my appointment, I placed my foot on the first notch of the zigzag next night, as the distant clocks were striking 11. He waited for me at the bottom with his white light on. "I have not called out," I said when we came close together. "May I speak now?" "By all means, sir." "Good night, then, and here's my hand." "Good night, sir, and here's mine." With that, we walked side by side to his box, entered it, and closed the door and sat down by the fire. "I have made up my mind, sir," he began, bending forward as soon as we were seated and speaking in a tone little above a whisper, "that you shall not have to ask what troubles me twice. I took you for someone else yesterday evening. That troubles me." "That mistake?" "No, sir, that someone else." "Who is it?" "I don't know. Like me, I don't know. I never saw the face. The left arm is across the face, and the right arm is waved violently. This way." I followed his action with my eyes. It was the action of an arm gesticulating with the utmost passion and vehemence. "For God's sake, clear the way." "One moonlit night," said the man, "I was sitting here when I heard a voice cry, 'Below there.' I started up and looked to the door, and saw there's someone else standing by the red light near the tunnel, waving as I just showed you now." The voice seemed hoarse with shouting, and it cried, "Look out! Look out!" And then again, Below there! Look out!" I caught my lamp and turned it on red and ran towards the figure, calling, "What's wrong? What has happened? Where?" It stood just outside the blackness of the tunnel. I advanced so close upon it that I wondered at its keeping sleeve across its eyes. I ran right up to it and had my hand stretched out to pull the sleeve away when it was gone. "Into the tunnel?" I said. "No. I ran into the tunnel 500 yards. I stopped and held my lamp above my head and saw the figures of the measured distance, saw the wet stains stealing down the walls and trickled through the arch. I ran out again faster than I had run in, for I had a mortal abhorrence of the place upon me. And I looked all around my red light. With my own red light. I went up the ladder towards the galley atop of it. I came back down again and ran back here. I telegraphed both ways. An alarm has been given. Is anything wrong?" The answer came back both ways. "All well." Resting now the slow touch of a frozen finger that traced my spine, I showed him how this figure must be a deception of his sense of sight, and that how figures originating from the disease of the delicate nerves that minister the functions of the eye were known to have often troubled patients, some of whom had become conscious of the nature of their affliction, and had even proved it by experiments upon themselves. "As to an imaginary cry," said I, "do but listen for a moment to to the wind in this unnatural valley while we speak so low, and to the wild harp it makes of the telegraph wires. That was all very well, he returned, and after we had sat there listening for a while, and he ought to know something of the wind and the wires, he who so often passed the long winter nights here alone and watching. But he would beg to remark he had not finished. I begged his pardon, and he slowly added these words, touching my arm. Within 6 hours after the appearance, the memorable accident happened on this line. And within 10 hours, the dead and wounded were brought along through the tunnel over the spot where the figure had stood. A disagreeable shudder crept over me, but I did my best against it. It was not to be denied, I rejoined, that this remark was a remarkable coincidence, calculated deeply to impress on his mind, but it was unquestionable that remarkable coincidences did continually occur, and that they must be taken into account when dealing with such a subject. Though, to be sure, I must admit, I had added, for I thought I saw he was going to bring objection to the bear upon me. Men of common sense did not allow for such coincidence in making the ordinary calculations of everyday life. He begged again to remark he had not finished. Again I begged his pardon for betraying into my interruptions. This, he said, again laying his hand upon me and glancing over my shoulder with hollow eyes, was just a year ago. 6 or 7 months passed, and I had recovered from the surprise and shock, when one morning, as the day was breaking, I, standing at my door, looked towards the red light, and saw the spectre again. He stopped, with a fixed look at me now. Did it cry out? No. It was silent. Did it wave its arm? No. It just leaned against the shaft of light with both hands before its face, like this. Once more I followed his action with my eyes. It was an action of mourning. I had seen an attitude in stone figures in tombs. Did you go up to it? I came in and sat down, partly to collect my thoughts and partly because it had turned me faint. When I again went to the door, the daylight was up off me and the ghost was gone. But nothing followed, nothing came of this. He touched me on the arm with his forefinger, twice or thrice, giving a ghastly nod each time. That very day, as a train came out of the tunnel, I noticed that a carriage on my side, what looked like a confusion of heads and hands, and something waved. I saw it just in time to signal the driver, stop. He shut off and put on his brake, but the train drifted past me 150 yards or more. I ran after it, and as I went along heard terrible screams and cries. A beautiful young lady had died instantaneously in one of the compartments, and was brought in here and laid down on the floor between us. Involuntarily I pushed my chair back as I looked from the boards to which he pointed to himself. True, sir, true. Precisely as it happened, so I tell it to you. Though I could think of nothing to say to any purpose, and my mouth was very dry, the wind and the wires took up the story with a long lamenting wail. He resumed, Now, sir, mark this, and judge how my mind is troubled. The spectre came back a week ago. Ever since now it has been there by fits and starts. At the danger light. What does it seem to do? He repeated, if possible with increased passion and vehemence, the former gestation of, For God's sake, clear the way. Then he went on, I have no peace or rest from it. It calls for me for many minutes at a time in an agonized manner. Below there, look out, look out! It stands there, waving at me. It rings my little bell. I caught at that. Did you ring your bell yesterday evening? I was here, and you were at the door. Twice. I see, I said, how your imagination misleads you. My eyes were on the bell, my ears were on the bell, and if I am a living man, it did not ring at those times. No, nor at any other time, except when it rung in the natural course of physical things by the station communicating with you. He shook his head. I have never made that mistake as yet, sir. I have never confused the spectre's ring with the bell. The ghost's ring is a strange vibration of the bell. It derives from nothing else. I have not asserted that the bell stirs to the eye. I don't wonder that you failed to hear it, but I heard it. And the spectre did seem to be there when you looked out? It was there. Both times? He repeated firmly. Both times. Will you come to the door now with me and look for it? He bit his under lip as though he was somewhat unwilling, but arose. I opened the door and stood on the step while he stood in the doorway. There was the danger light. There was the dismal mouth of the tunnel. There were the stone walls of the cutting. There were the stars, high above them. Do you see it? I asked him, taking particular note of his face. His eyes were prominent and strained, but not very much more so, perhaps, than my own when I had directed them earnestly towards the same spot. No, he answered. It is not there. Agreed, said I. We went in again and shut the door and resumed our seats. I was thinking of how best to improve this to my advantage, if it might be called one, when he took up the conversation in such a manner of course way, so that there could be no serious question of fact between us, that I felt myself placed in the weakest of positions. By this time, sir, you will fully understand what troubles me so dreadfully in the question. What does the spectre mean? I was not sure, I told him, but I did fully understand. What is its warning against? He said, ruminating with his eyes on the fire, and only by times turning them on me. What is the danger? Where is the danger? There is danger overhanging somewhere on the line. Some dreadful calamity will happen. It is not to be doubted this third time after what has gone before. But surely this is a cruel haunting of me. What can I do? He poured out a handkerchief and wiped the drops from his heated forehead. If I telegraph danger on either side, or on both, I can give no reason for it, he went on, wiping the palms of his hands. I should get into trouble and do no good. They would think I was mad. This is the way it would work. Message, danger, take care. Answer. What danger? Where? Message, don't know, but for God's sake, take care. They would displace me. What else could they do? His mind of pain was pitiable to see. It was the mental torture of a conscientious man, oppressed beyond endurance by an intelligible responsibility involving life. When it first stood there, under the danger light, he went on, putting his dark hair back from his head and drawing his hands outwards and across his temples in an extremity of feverish distress. Why not tell me where the accident was to happen, if it must happen? Why not tell me how it could be averted? If it could be averted. When on its second coming it hid its face, why not tell me instead she is going to die? Let her keep them at home. If it came to me on those two occasions only to show me that its warnings were true, and so as to prepare me for the third, why not warn me plainly now? And I, Lord help me, a poor signalman on this solitary station, why not go with somebody with credit to believe, and power to act? When I saw him in this state, I saw that for this poor man's sake, as well as for the public safety, what I had to do for the time was to compose his mind. Therefore, setting aside all question of reality or unreality between us, I represented to him that whoever thoroughly discharged his duties must do well, and that it was at least a comfort that he understood his duty, though he did not understand these confounding appearances. In this effort I succeeded far better in any attempt to reason him out of his conviction. He became calm. The occupations incidental to his post as the night advanced began to make larger demands on his attention, and I left him at 2 a.m. I had offered to stay through the night, but he would not hear of it. That I once more looked back to the red light as I ascended the pathway. That I did not like that red light, that I should have slept poorly had my bed been under it, I see no reason to conceal. Nor did I like the 2 separate sequences of the accident and the dead girl. I see no reason to conceal that either. But what ran most in my thoughts was the consideration of how I ought to act, having become recipient of this disclosure. I had proved the man to be intelligent, vigilant, and painstaking and exact, but how long might he remain so in his state of mind? Though in a subordinate position, still upheld the most important trust, And would I, for instance, like to stake my own life on the chances of his continuing to execute it with such precision? Unable to overcome a feeling that there would be something treacherous in my communicating what he had told me to his superiors of the company without first being plain with himself and proposing a middle course to him, I ultimately resolved to accompany him, otherwise keeping his secret for the present, to the wisest medical practitioner we could hear of in those parts, and to take his opinion. A change in his time of duty would come around the next night, he had apprised me, and he would be off an hour or two after sunrise, and on again after sunset. I had appointed to return accordingly. Next evening was a lovely evening, and I walked out early to enjoy it. The sun was not quite down yet when I traversed the field path near the top of the deep cutting. I would extend my walk for an hour, I said to myself, half an hour on and half an hour back, and it would then be time to go to my signalman's box. Before pursuing my stroll, I stepped to the brink and mechanically looked down from the point at which I had first seen him. I cannot describe the thrill that seized upon me when, close at the mouth of the tunnel, I saw the appearance of a man, with his left sleeve across his eyes, passionately waving his right arm. The nameless horror that oppressed me passed in a moment, and for in a moment I saw that the appearance of the man was a man indeed, and there was a little group of other men standing a short distance to whom he seemed to be rehearsing the gesture he made. The danger light was not yet lighted. Against its shaft, a little yellow hut, entirely new to me, had been made of some wooden supports and tarpaulin. It looked no bigger than a bed. With an irresistible sense that something was wrong, with a flashing self-reproachful fear that fatal mischief had come of my leaving the man there, and causing no one to be sent to overlook or correct what he did, I descended the notch path with all the speed I could make. "What is the matter?" I asked the men. "Signalman, killed this morning, sir." "Not the man belonging to that box?" "Yes, sir." "Not the man I know." "You will recognize him, sir, if you knew him," said the man who spoke for the others, solemnly uncovering his own head and raising an end of the tarpaulin, for his face is quite composed. "Oh, how did this happen?" I asked, turning from one to another as the hut closed in again. "He was cut down by an engine, sir. No man in England knew his work better, but somehow he was not clear of the outer rail. It was just as broad day. He had struck the light and had his lamp in his hand as the engine came out of the tunnel. His back was towards her, and she cut him down. The driver here was showing how it happened. Show the gentleman, Tom." The man, who wore a rough dark dress, stepped back to his former place at the mouth of the tunnel. "Coming round the corner, sir," he said. "I saw him as if I saw him at the end of a perspective glass. There was no time to check the speed, and I knew him to be very careful. He didn't seem to heed the whistle, sir. I shut it off while we were running down on him, and I called out as loud as I could." "What did you say?" "I said, 'Below! Look out! Look out! For God's sake, clear the way!' I started. It was a dreadful time, sir. I never left off calling to him. I put this arm before my eyes not to see, and waved to the last, but it was no use." Without prolonging the narrative to dwell on this or any one of the curious circumstances more than any other, I may, in closing, point out that it was coincidence that the warning of the engine driver included not only the words of which the unfortunate signalman repeated to me as haunting him, but also the words which I myself, not he, had attached, in my own mind, to the gesticulation he had imitated.